And there are three principles that we try to adhere to when we do this. The first one is, and this is one of the great benefits of on-site surveys, really, perhaps the greatest benefit of on-site surveys, is that you eliminate that memory bias that you have with many of the other methodologies. So email surveys, for example, which I find incredibly useful, but you do have that memory bias that comes into play. A question like this that you see on the screen right now: what was the purpose of your visit today? Quite a common question, a very popular one, and of course great, because what you're uncovering there is that goal that we spoke about, where it all starts. This is what starts that conversation. So this is something you need to be on top of. This is something you have to have a solid grip of. So it's an important question to answer. But ask this question even just a few hours after the user had been on your site, and you won't get the same quality response. So it's important when you use these different tools, your various research methodologies, understand the strengths and weaknesses of each of them. So email, I mentioned earlier, that's great. It has its own strengths and weaknesses. And the one that on-site surveys and Quality offers, which is something you have to use to your advantage, is that real-time nature. Then another one, and this is perhaps counterintuitive for some, but customer complaints, I would argue, is one of the most actionable pieces of insight. I'm, in fact, more interested in hearing from people who want to complain and who have something negative to say about the site than those who have something positive to say. And of course, you do want to hear the positive comments, and you can draw on that. You can use that insights, and I'll give you examples later on how we do it. But we spend hours trawling through GA and heat maps and survey responses and various other things. Your users will give it to you on a plate if you ask them a question like this. So this is right at the end of the funnel. You've just converted on the site, you've just bought, you've just signed up, whatever that conversion, and on the thank you page, on the final page, you pop this question: what is the one thing that almost put you off buying from us today, or whatever is the relevant language in your business model? And many people will go, but what do you mean? I've just bought from you. I don't get it. Why are you asking me this question? There'll be a small percentage of people who actually have something to say. And I've asked the team of optimizers at AWA who've been doing this for years. Consistently, they say, this is the question and the mechanism that gives them the most actionable, the jewels, the great nuggets. So it's a great question to have. And if you asked me to optimize a funnel, a site, and you limited me to one question and one technique only, this would be it. But the broader point here is to solicit that negative feedback, to understand where things are going wrong, because that's the easy bit in optimization, is to understand where things aren't going that smoothly and then to simply iron them out. Michael, I know you have a few interesting points to add here.
I do. Thank you, Johan. So with e-commerce sites in particular, acting on negative feedback in real time is so important. And there are two parts to this. There's the first part of acting on that feedback or closing the loop, as it helps the customer feel heard and allows for more detailed and personal feedback when you have that one-on-one interaction when it's possible. Now, the second point is in real time. And that's so crucial because you might not have a chance to intercept that visitor again. They might go to the competition at that point. They might never return to your website. And one effective and scalable method for closing the loop in real time is to send that feedback to your department or team that is best suited to address this feedback. So consider the question, either one, what is the one thing that almost put you off from buying with us today? Or what stopped you from purchasing today? If a customer mentions that the price is too high, you can send that information to your sales team so they can develop a custom plan or pricing and therefore help facilitate the sale. Now, if a customer also said something like difficulty or dissatisfaction on site, your support team would be more than capable to identify the issue, show care, and ultimately help facilitate that sale as well. Now, how would you be able to send this information at a scalable level? With Qualaroo, you do have two options, and one of which would be the Slack integration. So you could push data to a dedicated channel for all of your teams to review and dole out as necessary. Now, the second option is with the Zapier integration that allows you to push your data to an endpoint of your choosing, such as an SMS message, email, or a spreadsheet, and ultimately segment that feedback based on positive or negative sentiment, keywords, or specific answers provided. So it's very important to make sure that you act on that feedback, but at the right time, and there are quite a few ways to make that happen.
Yeah, I love that point about integration as well. You know, Qualaroo on its own is a fantastic tool, and as you heard Angela said, we've been using it for, I think, as long as it existed, more or less. We've been with it for a long time and obviously get a lot of value from it. But you can multiply that value by using these integrations that you're talking about, Michael. And so, for example, the one that works really well for me is that Slack integration. And if you're a team and you can in one of your Slack channels have this constant feed of insights coming into, and you can pick up the ones that you have to react to immediately, that becomes infinitely powerful. Moving on to principle 3, the last one, before we look at some lists of questions and some case studies. This is an easy one, and it's simply to ask follow-on questions. And you know, this is the famous NPS, Net Promoter Score. What is the likelihood that you would recommend this product, whatever it is, to a friend or colleague? And there's science behind this, and you know, we won't go into the detail of how you would interpret this, but this is a great metric to use. But there's a lot you can do with it. The question, from my perspective, in an optimization context, is how actionable is this? Because this is a forward-looking metric, but in terms of immediate actionability, there's something missing. And what's missing is this follow-on question. In this case, what is the reason for your answer? And again, looking at principle 2, that negative feedback. So if you segment your answers to this second question by people who responded 0 or 1 or 2, in other words, not likely at all, these are the people who saying they extremely unlikely to recommend your company to a friend or recommend your product to a friend. You want to hear what that's all about. You want to hear what they have to say. And typically those insights are the insights that you can use to really make a big difference. So looking at some questions, and again, it's worth repeating that this is a non-exhaustive list. There are only 6 questions. And of course, there are hundreds of ways in which you can pose these questions. But let's look at some of them. And it starts with, as I said at the very beginning, what you're trying to do. So if you're trying to drive conversions or one specific KPI, then these are the style of questions you would ask. And you'd see now how that differs from other types of questions. What information would you like to see before making a decision? So that's asking somebody to kind of access that decision that they're making, that sales conversation, and asking them to be specific about what questions do they have, and if there were a salesperson present at this point, and if it was a store environment, what are those questions that they would ask? Accept price. What would stop you buying from us today? This is before they get to the checkout point, perhaps, or it could be an abandonment survey. So as they're about to exit the page, and I put that accept price deliberately in there because, you know, given half a chance, almost everyone will say that, oh, it's too expensive. But that's never really the full story. So you want to get behind that. And so I often put that little bit, that tail in there. What's your biggest frustration with using a website? Now that's more to do with the UI perhaps, or the UX. But if you frame it broadly, and if you have an open text response, then you can get some interesting feedback. What's your number one concern about buying from us? There again, it's about the decision. What's holding you back from making a purchase right now? And this you could execute in a number of ways. 2 ways in which I do it quite often, and the team at AWA, it would either be an abandonment survey, or it would be after a certain number of seconds, so 60 seconds, we would look at analytics, and we would look at the average time on that page, and we would try and segment that and maybe find the time on page for people who don't convert, or you could dive even deeper. And then we use that as a guideline to decide what is that threshold, how long should it be, what might have convinced you to complete a purchase with us today, obviously asked at right at the end of the funnel when they're abandoned. Then let's say you want to refine your value proposition. We're not going to talk too much about value proposition, but this is such an important topic, and it's worth constantly iterating on this, constantly finding a better way, a sharper way, a more compelling way to express your value proposition. And I will say this, that your value proposition is not made up in a boardroom. It is determined in the mind of the user. So you have to go to that source, and Qualaroo gives you an ideal way to access that insight that will allow you to articulate your value proposition, and even before you articulate it, to determine what that is. So here are some of the questions. Which other options did you consider before buying from us? And the reason this is important is it cuts to the heart of value proposition. Why would I buy from you as opposed to somebody else? That's the definition from the guy who came up with the term in the 80s. How would you describe this product to somebody else? Open text response again, and the way in which people talk about your product, even the exact language they use, you can sometimes use that verbatim, and I'll show you an example of that later on. What persuaded you to buy this product from us today? How do you justify the investment in this item, especially when it's a big investment? I've used this very successfully when I work on high ticket items, when I work on something where price is an issue, and hearing from customers who've bought this and hearing them tell you how they justified in their mind, that gives you great insight in, if you can mirror that back to non-converters, that's often very successful. And so the list goes on. There's another interesting application for this, and that is testing product market fit. And the product managers among you may be more interested in this, but this was devised by Sean Ellis, who incidentally was with Qualaroo a couple of years ago, and who came up with coined the term growth hacking. Incredibly sharp marketer. And so he came up with this question: how disappointed would you be if this product no longer existed tomorrow? And then you've got these 4 answers in radio buttons at the bottom. And what Sean found out was that if you had 40% or more people saying very disappointed, then you've reached what he calls must-have status. In other words, this is a product you absolutely can't do without. And that's a great place to be for a marketer, as you can imagine. But what happens if you're not there? And perhaps most of us aren't there. And this is where principle 3, I beg your pardon, kicks in, which is the follow-on question. So Sean came up with these questions that you would ask to those who didn't answer as you would hope they would. What would you likely use as an alternative if this product were no longer available? What is the primary benefit that you have received from it? What type of person do you think would benefit? And these kinds of questions, the responses, and this would be open text responses, this follow-on question. And the responses you get from this, if you act on that, will edge you closer to that elusive must-have status. So a great one to use if that's the phase that your product is in. I mentioned earlier that we've also used Qualaroo in exciting ways to understand cross-device behavior. And this is a big topic because, it's so hard to do. It's becoming increasingly prominent, this cross-device journey. And it's difficult to find a tool that will give you exact data. It doesn't really exist at the moment. Many tools are getting close to it, but one of the pieces of the puzzle that we use is Qualaroo. And so here's one example. I'll show you another one on the next slide. But we would ask, on which device are you likely to buy? Now, there's a caveat here. People aren't generally aren't good at predicting their own behavior. And what you're asking them here to do is to predict their own behavior. But it's one piece of the puzzle, as I say. You won't take this as gospel. You won't necessarily make the statement that this is the absolute truth, but it's an indication. It provides one piece of the understanding, and in collaboration with some of the other insights and some of the other tools and other observations, you come closer to that understanding. I've actually found it to be remarkably accurate on many of the projects that I've worked with. And you can see how it plays out there. So you've got your quantification of how people certainly in that moment think they might react. But then what's actually more important is you see that second line each time, view these responses. And that's because they have the opportunity when they make their selection, when they pick one of these, they have the opportunity to say something more, to elaborate. And again, you get great insight from that open text response where people tell you why it is that they think in that moment that they'll buy from a given device. And that often allows us to do some device-specific optimization because we understand that journey so much better. The other question that I've often used, and it's amazing seeing what comes back at you, is this blunt question on a mobile device, always on a mobile. Tell us where you are at the moment and what you're doing. What's the point of this question? It simply paints a very clear picture of exactly how disjointed and distracted the mobile experience tends to be. Here are some actual responses that I've seen coming back, and these are the themes that regularly come back at us. People are in a meeting. They're sitting in a meeting at the back of the room, and they're browsing your site. They're cooking dinner. They're in bed. They're on the sofa watching telly. In fact, that's probably the one that comes up the most. I'm on my sofa watching television, or I'm in bed about to go to sleep. Now, that's not conducive to any sale being made, but it's important to understand this context so that you can see your conversion rate on mobile, and you can see your journey in that context and with that background. And if you put it all together, then you're in a position to optimize that part of the journey much better, because maybe, and this is often the case, the mobile journey should look entirely different compared to the desktop journey. And this will become clear when you look at responses from a question like this. You don't only have to ask a question. You can do things like this, which is actually use Qualaroo to drive a conversion directly. So this is an exit pop-up, but it's been formatted in this way, where it becomes a value proposition articulation. So you're about to exit the page, and there it is, a final attempt at winning you back before you exit. Why should you book directly on this particular hotel website? So great use of this tool. Of course, when you deal with any tool, and this one is no exception, there's some common mistakes that you have to avoid. We've spoken about many of these long or complicated questions. Obviously, I hope nobody's doing that. You don't want to annoy people with a question on every page. You want to limit the number of questions that people see in any particular journey. And you can, with Qualaroo, you can exclude people from seeing specific questions. You can set them up to be mutually exclusive. Don't hit them as soon as they arrive on the site. Give them a couple of seconds. And then the one there about overcomplex question branching, that's really just for your own sake, is when you use a lot of question branching, it makes it harder to analyze. I tend to take that punishment and because the way the insights that come back at you, the information, the data that you get back is, in my mind, worth that effort. But it's something certainly to consider if you're short on resources. And then you want to avoid asking questions on crucial pages. For example, where you're entering card information, where people may be particularly sensitive about giving giving you answers.